G'day. I bought a few old bits of measuring equipment over the last 6 months and been cleaning them up and putting them back into service, but I suddenly realised, well, that's probably something that other people may like to know a little bit about. So this is just a few of the things that I've picked up over the years about measuring equipment and what can be done with it, and just a few tips on its use and its care. This arrived in the workshop the other day. It's a depth gauge, it's a dial depth gauge, Mitutoyo, and I started cleaning it up, and then I thought actually it's probably a good subject for a video to give a few hints about this sort of stuff. One of the first things I do usually when I get a piece of measuring gear is I will clean it, but I'll use a solvent, some meths or alcohol or even acetone if I'm lacking either of those, although acetone's a little bit aggressive, just to clean up all the oil and grease that's left. Things like knurls, you can run along with a fine wire brush, whether it be brass or stainless or something like that, along the line of the knurl, and you can clean those out. With the cross knurl there, you've got to go both ways, but you can do that. Also with a sharp pointed object, you can also scrape down those too to get the muck out. One word of warning though, things with a dial like this, usually these dials have got a spring on them to put a bit of tension on, and so you want to be very careful that you don't just decide, okay, I'm going to completely disassemble this, take this off, because you may lose the tension on the spring and have a devil of a time getting it back. But having said that, that's all possible. What I like to do is I like to disassemble things as much as I can, bearing in mind the thing about the dial. So, for example, unscrew that part, slide that off, clean those, so that you can get right in and get the dirt off. With plates like this that are screwed on, that one there I could take right off, and that was fine. I could clean under that, I could clean the plate. This one, because I had the dial on, I just removed 2 screws, cleaned this end, put those screws back, removed these 2 screws, cleaned this end, and so on. Okay, so basically a good clean to get any residual muck and dirt off. In here I wouldn't use a rag because there's very fine gear teeth in there, but certainly a fine haired brush just to clean that groove out would be a good idea. I mentioned a moment ago about using solvents to clean off oil and dirt. You do need to be careful with that. This is a set of pin gauges. Now you might just be able to make out there that there's some blobby looking numbers there, and that's because I gave this thing a wipe with a solvent, not realizing that the ink they used for marking the sizes was dissolvable in that solvent. So just something you do need to check, and maybe it's one of those things, as they say, you know, test in an inconspicuous area to just to see what the effect is. With precision measuring gear, you do need to look after it, keep it in a case or something like that if you can. Now this case is a bit worse for wear. As you can see, it's a vacuum formed part, and it's been beaten up and beaten around. The plastic's got brittle, it's snapped. There's not much hope for this one, and so what I may have to end up doing for this is making up a new wooden case, or at least making up some way of repairing that just so that it stays in one piece. One trick that I have discovered for things like that, this is just a 1/4-inch socket set. I've had this for quite some time, but these vacuum form cases do crack and split as well. However, what I worked out was that I worked in a place where they used polyurethane resin for potting things, and so what I've done is I've used some tape to just seal up all the holes, and then I've poured polyurethane resin in here, and that's basically made this a solid piece. And that's one way of making sure that these vacuum formed liners don't break up on you, or at least don't break up on you for a long time. Ideally, to keep the rust fairies at bay, you want to try and keep things in boxes. These are just a couple of micrometers I've got. This one is pretty good, except that I had to replace the foam after a while. The foam gets a bit manky, so take that out and replace that. But apart from that, it's pretty good. This, by the way, is another one of my ways of getting around the battery problem. As I get older, my sight's not at what it used to be, and so I use mechanical digital micrometers where I can, and I find that that gets me at least close enough that I can then read the vernier with some confidence. This particular box here I actually had to make up from scratch. I got the micrometer, the box had pretty much had it, and so I made up a box. They don't have to be anything terribly special, but just enough to keep the dust off, the moisture out, all that sort of thing. One thing you do need to watch is the type of timber you use, because if you're using something like an oak or something like that, you may find that the acids in the timber do actually affect the equipment. One thing I do with these things is I'll get a bit of Vaseline or light oil, sewing machine oil is fine, and just rub over all the exposed metal parts, and that way at least there's a coating of oil on there. You can even use the original boxes these things came in. This is a small level I have. I just keep it in this cardboard box, and the cardboard box is slowly falling apart, but you know, at least it's keeping the item under wraps. And I think I've even got here, yes, there we go, directions for use. So one day someone's going to want to put this in a museum or something, I think. A lot of the measuring gear that I have got around the place is not battery powered. I've got a battery powered caliper and a battery powered height gauge, but that's really about it. The better known brands, the Mitutoyos, the Starretts, the batteries seem to last longer. They've got better circuitry in there, doesn't drain, but certainly the less expensive ones can drain a battery very quickly. And one of the things that I don't like is basically using something once every 6 months and having to buy a battery every time because the battery's gone flat in the meantime. So I'll have a lot of dial gauges, vernier gauges in my workshop for little used or seldom used measuring equipment in particular. On batteries, it's worth noting too, there are two common types used in calipers. One goes by, or one of the names it goes by is an SR44, and the other version is an LR44, L for lithium, S for silver. The difference being that the silver oxide batteries, the discharge curve is sort of flat and then drops off, whereas the lithium one drops away quite quickly. So if you put a lithium battery in your calipers, the chances are that very soon you'll get a low battery light coming out. That's just because it's dropped below that level that the silver oxide will maintain. So if you can, I'd certainly recommend using silver oxide batteries rather than lithium batteries. One thing I do like about Mitutoyo and Starrett gear is that you can generally get on the web parts diagrams and parts lists. This is for the dial depth gauge that I was just talking about, and so this is an exploded diagram, and so it makes it very easy to check whether you've got everything. Some of these also list in the parts lists will list accessories that come with it as well. In this particular case, I soon discovered that there was a copper shoe that was missing here, and so I was able to get a bit of copper and make up a new part for it to return it to, well, probably not original condition, but certainly better than it was. Without that, these knobs tend to flop around a bit because they're usually not long enough to go all the way. I've talked about this one before, but when you've got a slight bit of surface rust, one way of getting that off is to rub with a piece of aluminium foil. Now, this part here I've already done, but if I give that a bit of a rub there, you can possibly see that there's a bit of smattering of surface rust there, and that's clear over there. Why that works, I'm not quite sure. Whether it's something to do with the iron oxide and the aluminium oxide on the surface of the foil having some sort of chemical reaction or whatever, don't know. Could just be straight mechanical abrasion. But if you've got very light surface rust, sometimes aluminium foil will be enough to take that off for you. Another thing worth getting hold of, if you can, is this brown paper, which is meant to be a rust inhibitor. It's got some form of chemical in there which does all sorts of things, and that's all very good. But the reason this is here, this is one of the few pieces of kit I think I bought new. Must have been sick that day or something. However, notice how they've got a bit of a wax coating on the end of these things. Don't just pull that off and throw it away. Keep that, because that's another way of protecting things against rust and all that sort of thing. Now, one question is, how do you check the accuracy of things like micrometers? Well, on a micrometer like this, you can have or usually do get, when you buy new, a little gauge piece like this. Second hand, you take your chances, and I've got some micrometers that don't have it. I have to use others like this one to check those. But what you can do then is just zero this out. The standard technique is 2 clicks slowly, and that gives you a repeatable amount of force on this. And as you can see, this is reading 25.01, and this thimble here is reading 25.01. So the dial and the instrument agree. If I wanted to adjust that, I could get the spanner out and just pull that down a little bit to get that to line up, but I don't particularly want to do that at the moment. With a 0 to something micrometer, of course, you can zero it out against itself like that. Now, one of the other things to think about too is, if you wanted to check this, if you had some gauge blocks and you wanted to check this to make sure it was accurate all the way along, because really you're just saying, is that 0? Yes, it's 0. You don't know whether there's an error in the screw. So you can use your slip blocks to put in there and try it. But what you have to be careful with there is that you don't always pick slips which are whole numbers, as in, 2 millimeters, 5 millimeters, 12 millimeters, 15 millimeters, because what that means is that if there's any cyclic error in the screw involved in these, that will show up. That will be hidden, because you're always using that same portion of the screw. So you might choose, say, 5.25 and 17.5 and 22.25 and all that sort of thing, and that should give you a much better look at how the screw in the micrometer is. You can check the flatness of the faces using an optical slip, but you have to have a monochromatic light source, so I don't bother with that. But if this was a professional metrology lab, that's what they'd be doing, just to make sure that the faces were flat and uniform. Then there's the question of, is the instrument any good? Now, the most common form of damage that occurs with these things is they get dropped. With a micrometer, if it gets dropped, you might bend something, and the easiest way of checking for that is feeling whether that screw is uniform. If there's a tight spot that always occurs in the same place, same sort of reading, then there's a fair chance that it's been dropped. There's a slight bend there. That doesn't necessarily make it useless, but it just means that, for instance, if it's a bit stiff, you may not be able to use the ratchet. With the calipers, checking the tips, I know this one's been dropped because I've dropped it several times. This is my do anything pair of calipers, unfortunately. A few hot chips metal are there as well, but calipers are a similar sort of thing. If they've been bent, you might notice a stiff spot. I once bought a set of calipers which were claimed to be carbon fibre, and they were floppy as anything, so that's another thing to watch for. You need to make sure that the gib strip is adjusted up so that you've got a nice smooth travel, but it doesn't rock around. These things don't actually need much in the way of lubricant. Maybe a small drop of very light oil, and then wipe most of it off after you've done that a few times, just to get the stuff through, but you really don't need to do terribly much to them. One thing you can do with calipers is put a bit of paper between the jaws and gently pull, and you should have a uniform force to pull that off. You can also hold them up to the light and see whether you've got a uniform gap there, or whether they are you know, there's when they're meant to be closed, there's a bit of a gap and light can come through, all that sort of thing, and that will show you that the jaws are worn as well. One thing I will mention is dial indicators, used quite a lot in the workshop. They're a real workhorse. Once again, you shouldn't be lubricating that. The chances are that dust and things will stick to the oil and you know, clog things up or grind things away. There are special lubricants that you use. The backs on these are typically can be removed, and you can either turn that round or you can get a plain back. The biggest trap with these is whether they're metric or imperial. Metric dial gauges, the tip thread is M2.5 by, I think it's 0.45, and that will be something like 8 millimeters, I think, or you know, a metric size anyway. On an imperial dial gauge, that thread is a 448, I believe, and you'll find that the diameters here will be an imperial version. So if this was an 8 millimeter one in metric, on an imperial version, it might be a 5/16. Just something to watch. They do change. As I said, you can get different sorts of backs. You can have ones with the plunger is actually in the back, and you hang on to it here, like my Starrett 196. All sorts of stuff like that. Very handy things to have, but yes, there is a difference between metric and imperial. One thing to note on second-hand measuring equipment is engraving. Particularly if it's come out of a factory, there'll probably be an asset number or possibly someone's name if it's personal equipment. There's usually some form of serial number on some of the better made gear as well, but that bit's the bit that concerns a lot of people. They don't like seeing that on there. Depends a bit on how it's made. You can get percussive type engravers, which is a whole bunch of dimples. You can get an electrical type thing which uses an arcing action to nibble material away, or you could engrave it with a rotary type tool. There's probably a few other ways of doing things, but really for something like that, I can just feel that slightly raised. I might run a stone of that over that just to get it flat. I have heard people who will, if they've got very shallow engraving or naming of something, they'll actually run a surface grinder over the top and just, you know, take that off if it's only a you know, a tenth or so, or a few tenths deep, just to get rid of that engraving. It's really up to you. Some people don't like it. Some people see it as part of the heritage of the gear. So there you go, a little bit on measuring gear, and I'd like to thank Peter Cooper once again as my inspiration for this lot, as he was one of the first people to show me some of this sort of thing, and it's come in very handy over the years, so thank you, Peter. Anyway, hope this has been of use to people, and we'll see you for the next one.